Donovan, welcome to Psyche Podcast. This is really exciting to have you on. I'm doing this series exploring Nietzsche's ideas from a variety of different perspectives, and I'm super excited to be able to just explore what you think he meant by, the will to power. But before we go there, I just kind of want to give, anyone who's listening in the live feed or a later recording, just a kind of a sense of who you are as a person, what you're up to in terms of your career, your scholarship. And once we do that, we can then jump into the conversation if that works for you.
Sure, that works. Thanks so much for the invitation. Very glad to be here. Um, I'm particularly excited to be talking to someone who's outside of that narrow world of Nietzsche scholars, somebody who works as a therapist. I think one of the things that drew me to Nietzsche is his psychological insight. He also belongs to a certain kind of philosopher, a distinctive kind of philosopher who is in many ways therapeutic in his methods. There are lots of thinkers like that, people like Wittgenstein and Socrates in ways, Kierkegaard. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting connection that you're interested in philosophy and that's your background. So just a little bit about me. I'm a professor of philosophy at Wright State University. That's in Dayton, Ohio. I live just outside of there at a little town called Yellow Springs. Um, I've been working on Nietzsche for a really long time. My primary job is teaching. I'm in an undergraduate department, so research isn't my main focus. But when I do have time to write and when I have time to do research, Nietzsche is someone who I'm always coming back to. I think he was one of the philosophers who first drew me to philosophy. I was originally interested in visual art and literature, and then I realized I'd rather be talking about them than making them. And I was reading, I think I took an existentialism course because of my interest in literature. And I encountered Nietzsche and I realized, okay, this guy's doing something I'm interested in. And I immediately moved into philosophy. And as I said, Nietzsche's psychological insight is one of the things that drew me. And when I went to graduate school, I went to the University of Toronto. I did my dissertation on Freud and Nietzsche. So I was comparing Freud and Nietzsche's theories of the drives and the unconscious. And I was asking what those theories about human nature meant for political possibilities. So that's the other side of it. I was always interested in politics, in understanding how we go about deciding what's politically possible, and especially the way we constrain our political imagination by assumptions about human nature. One thing you'll often hear is conservatives will sometimes pride themselves on being either realists about human nature or sometimes even pessimists, right? I have a very grim view of human beings. They're awful, beastly creatures, and that's why I'm a conservative. And then you'll hear the opposite, which is, oh, well, if you're on the left, it must mean you're starry eyed, idealistic, utopian about human nature. And that always struck me as just a false premise, right? A mistaken premise. And Nietzsche drew me because he has a view of human nature that can be read very pessimistically. I think it's very, very complicated, but it's not pessimistic in the true sense. It's not optimistic in the usual sense. It's something much more gray, much more multifarious, much more open-ended than that. That's what I like about his theory of human nature. He gives us a way of understanding our motivations that can send us in all sorts of different directions. It can explain the extremities of human behavior. So that's what really intrigued me. I had been reading a lot of Freud as a way of trying to make sense of the sub-rational side of human behavior. But I was dissatisfied with Freud, and I saw this glimmer of some alternate possibility in Nietzsche, just a glimmer, because on the surface, Nietzsche also seems to be a bit pessimistic. And so that's why I ended up getting back into Nietzsche again. And I think I was wrestling with this interpretation of the will to power from the beginning. Right after I finished my PhD, I started my philosophy career as I was teaching. I continued to teach a variety of different areas. I'm still interested in the arts. I teach philosophy of art and aesthetics. I teach literature in most of my courses just because I love literature. I teach a lot of 19th and 20th century French and German philosophy, mostly in ethics and social and political philosophy. And then, of course, I'm also very interested in the socialist and Marxist and critical theory traditions as well. And then, of course, because of my interest in Nietzsche, I've also always had a foot in the existentialist traditions. So that's where my interest lay. All of my research and my publications have been in those areas. But Nietzsche has always been the one that I've been wrestling with, partly because I'm frustrated with him. I'm dissatisfied with him. I don't like where he ends up, but I don't trust how he gets there. I'm convinced that there's more going on than we often think. And so I'm hoping after this two volume piece to be getting closer to being done with Nietzsche, but we'll see. Maybe I can move on and get away from him. In the future, I'll probably move more into contemporary debates in political philosophy. I might start doing some more direct engagement with Marx, but I don't know for sure.
Oh
And
yeah, that all sounds so fascinating, man. There's so many questions that I want to ask you, especially about like the connection between Nietzsche and Freud, and you know what you found in his human nature. But maybe we can kind of save that hopefully for a future conversation, because I was hoping we can kind of touch on a lot of these different themes. Where I'm kind of wanting to go for just a second to kind of highlight your work are the two books that you wrote, you know, Nietzsche's Immoralism and Politics After Morality. I know there's so much that you could say about it, but I was maybe hoping you could kind of introduce how you got to the point where you kind of created this project, and then maybe that can lead us into exploring the will to power, if that works for you.
right. Sure. The books grew out of this sense I had that at some point in his development, Nietzsche's philosophy starts to go in a different direction than his ideals. And that he doesn't entirely acknowledge this. It may be because he doesn't completely recognize it. It might be because in some ways he's trying to suppress it. Because his heart is in one place, and I think his philosophy is leading him somewhere else. And so that's what I wanted to make sense of, and that's why it turned into kind of a two-book project. It wasn't supposed to be originally, but I realized I needed to kind of break it up into these two aspects. You have what I consider to be the heart of Nietzsche's philosophical commitments, especially by the end of his writing life. Those are his commitment to a certain way of thinking about fate, which is, I argue, a version of determinism, a rejection of any strong, morally relevant kind of free will. And then you also have, and it's connected to that, his rejection of moralism. People often recognize he's a critic of morality or of traditional morality. I try to stress that it's not just about his critique of morality, which still leaves quite a bit of morality intact. He's not rejecting it entirely. Instead, it's a critique of moralism, which is a way of using moral concepts and moral language to try and transform and improve people. Nietzsche was interested in transforming and improving people, but because of his growing move towards a more deterministic and fatalistic picture of individuality, he no longer thinks that moralistic means can be effective at transforming people. So I take that to be the heart of his core philosophical insights. And in the first book, I try and show that by the end of his philosophical career, he's starting to make sense of politics through that lens. If morality can't deeply change us using moralistic methods, and we can talk a little bit more about what that means, and that also means that culture generally, even education, can't dramatically shape and change us, then what can? Because Nietzsche's still concerned with enhancing, is his favorite word, enhancing human beings. How can he do that? And politics turns out to be the solution to that. But that's something he only reaches at the very end. Most of his life, he is looking to art, he's looking to philosophy, he's looking to morality, and he's looking to culture to change us. So it's a kind of crisis in his work when he comes to this conclusion that those things aren't actually going to get him there. And it's only very late that I feel his work forces him in a political direction. And so we only get the beginnings, sort of a sketch of what his political thinking would look like. But because that beginning of philosophy is rooted in these core philosophical concepts, which are in some ways at odds with his original ideals. All of his life, he is captured by this image of the really great, unique, heroic, superb individual. He's just enraptured with admiration of historically exceptional geniuses, right? As a philologist studying ancient culture, he loves the world of pre-Socratic Greece, in part because he loves this world of these demigods and these heroic individuals who inspire both fear and admiration because they're so beyond the ordinary. And I think in part that's a psychological need for Nietzsche. He's born into a circumstance which is a bit unusual. He's growing up in this very tiny little village in Germany. You can still go there. It's still this tiny little place. His father is a minister. He dies when he's just a small child. So he's lost his father. His family's very devoutly religious, but they don't have a lot of means. They're relatively poor, especially for an aspiring academic. He's only able to attend a very good school because of he's let in because of his academic ability. And so he always has this kind of, I think, inferiority complex. And his whole family has this. His mother and his sister are very, very conscious of their social status. And they're very aware that because his father died so early, his father, who was educated, was their sort of route into a higher level of society. So they feel kind of like they've been deprived of the possibility to move up in the world. And that's where Nietzsche comes from. And all his life, he's plagued with this sense of a kind of insufficiency, of an inferiority. And I think that's one of the reasons why he's drawn to these historical examples of great individuals, many of whom overcome great obstacles and great suffering. And that encourages him. It gives him hope. He, of course, has a very, very difficult life. It's a life of great physical pain. He's in terrible health his entire life. It just gets worse. He loses his job. He has to retire early. His academic reputation's destroyed very early in his life. He never gets married. He never really has a close family or set of friends because he's constantly moving and he's always solitary. So he had this need for models and for ideals to keep him going. And I think that was always there from the beginning. And I think in many ways, that wasn't a philosophical commitment, right? This is part of the reason why I'm interested in the psychology of Nietzsche, both his insight into human psychology, but also the way it reflects on his own ideas, his own life, his own behavior, his own choices. And I think some of the choices he made were choices he had to make. These were values he needed to survive. They weren't necessarily determined by his philosophical thought. So what happens is that the move that his philosophy makes pushes him in a direction that's at odds with these values that he needs to thrive, that he needs to survive. And so not surprisingly, he kind of suppresses that. So in the second book, what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, we've seen what Nietzsche's core commitments are. We've seen what his unique contributions to philosophy are. We've seen his understanding of fatality. We've seen his understanding of an ideal of the love of fate. We've seen his rejection of moralistic means for changing human beings. We've seen his understanding of human psychology rooted in the will to power, which we're going to talk about today. But what does that mean for political philosophy proper? If Nietzsche is going in a direction where he's establishing a political program, right? He has this vision of the world he wants to live in, and it's an aristocratic world, which, I mean, you can envision many different versions of aristocracy, and the most, authoritarian and vicious ones that people sometimes attribute to Nietzsche are completely misguided. Nietzsche tells us what he envisions when he thinks of an aristocratic society. He imagines Renaissance Italy. That's one of the principal examples he thinks of. So by no means is that a democratic culture. By no means is that a leftist political system, but it's certainly also not a proto-fascist world, right? So it's not the world that right-wing interpretations of Nietzsche give us. But nevertheless, it's a very aristocratic one. It's a very anti-egalitarian one. And my case that I make is that this is something that is not supported by his core philosophical commitments. Not only does he not have to endorse that kind of politics, but it ultimately contradicts many of his core commitments, and it's doomed to failure. So we should reconstruct a way of thinking about specific political ideals and principles, a vision of the political future that's true to the core of Nietzsche's what I call metapolitics. That's his foundational politics, not that aristocratic program that he wishes into being. We should create a philosophically consistent alternative to Nietzsche's politics. And so the second book, I say very emphatically, we're departing from Nietzsche. We're telling him, you've got something very wrong. You've also got something right, but you've got something very wrong. And we're going to do some surgery. We're going to cut you up. We're going to disassemble you. We're going to throw out the bad parts, and we're going to remake you. We're going to rebuild you into something hopefully better, something with the potential for philosophical consistency and also maybe for more practical success, because I think that's the key problem with Nietzsche's vision of politics is it's a fantasy, it's a fairy tale, it's wish fulfillment. It tells us what his heart wants. It doesn't tell us what his head tells us is possible.
Oh, that's really fascinating, Donovan, and just a super helpful kind of overview. I was maybe hoping you could say one more thing about, your two books, which I think will help us as we think about will to power. In the intro to Nietzsche's Immoralism, you talk about, your almost methodology is to read Nietzsche backwards. Mm-hmm. And, as someone who's not a philosophy expert, I didn't understand exactly the differences in his corpus, but so I was just hoping, but it made sense, the point of starting at the end and going backwards in light of what you wrote in the book. So I was hoping you could kind of explain why you do that and what that means.
Right. That's a great question. And I think it applies outside of philosophy as well. But yeah, this is definitely something I strongly emphasized at the beginning, because most interpreters of Nietzsche, when they read him, they do read him sort of chronologically. And my worry is that when you do that, you bring in some distortion to the bigger picture. There are some figures where chronological interpretation might work really well. But the assumption you're making when you say, okay, I'm going to understand this writer's ideas, and I'm going to start with their earliest writings and work my way to their final writings, and that's the best way to understand them. First of all, I think that presumes that a writer of any kind, not just a philosopher, this would be true of a novelist or a creator or an artist, that their life is going to have this kind of fairly consistent linear progression. They might change their views and their ideas over time, but it's going to all make sense. A is going to lead to B, B is going to lead to C, C is going to lead to D. And so even if they change their mind, by going in order, you're going to understand exactly why they changed their mind. And you're going to better understand what was wrong with the first idea and what was right about the new one, right? Another assumption of chronological interpretation, and this goes into some philosophical background a bit, is people often bring what I consider a Hegelian kind of interpretation to chronology. Hegel thinks that we progress through contradiction and conflict, both historically, when you look at the history of nations and civilizations, and you see civil wars and foreign wars and those kinds of conflicts, which seem destructive, they seem like regression, but ultimately they can lead to progress. Hegel takes that idea very far, and he says, even in science, even in philosophy, we progress the same way. You have contradictory ideas, they come into battle with one another, and through this conflict, we recognize that there's an element of truth in both sides, and we fuse them together into a synthesis, and then we have this new, better idea. But the new, better idea still contains elements of the things we've left behind. And so when I read an author chronologically, I'm often making this assumption. I want to understand what Nietzsche believed at the end of his life, or maybe at his culmination, at his most finished point. Well, some people will say you can't do that unless you also know everything he left behind. It's not good enough to know his final answer. You have to know all of his false starts. You have to know all of his changes of mind. You have to know all of his conflicts. Why would that be? That would only be true if, in some sense, the final version contains all the rehearsals in some small form. And again, I don't think that's always true. It's sometimes true, but sometimes a thinker will just realize I'm on the wrong track. I've just got to completely veer into a different course. And if you want to understand that new course, you need to understand it on its own terms. If you try to understand it through their previous ideas, you're going to distort it. So the biggest worry for Nietzsche especially, some people don't think Nietzsche's core convictions change deeply. A lot of people think that there are three kind of phases he goes through: an early, a middle, and a late. I think we should distinguish a late and a final period, because in the last year of his writing life, this is right before he loses his sanity, he writes a flurry of books, and he completes 5 books. They don't actually get published yet, but he completes 5 books in that 1 year. And I think that final year of writing involves some pretty important departures, even from what people usually consider his late work. So what happens if we ignore that and we just go chronologically? What happens is we start with early works, which contain some of the same terminology. They contain some of the same concepts in different form, some of the same language. And we read those early works and we start to define his concepts and define his terms using those early works. Once we do that, we've already kind of put a framework in place that traps us. Now, when we move forward, if we encounter a new idea in Nietzsche or a change of heart in Nietzsche, we're going to have to try and force it to fit this framework we already have. So we're going to take a word like power, which we've interpreted from his early books. We're going to see a new way he uses the word power in a new work. And we're going to try and find a concept of power that will fit both. And in doing so, we may be failing to recognize he's rejecting the early version. He's departing from it. So my worry is this goes hand in hand with another part of the introduction, which is I try to suggest that we approach Nietzsche, and this is not just Nietzsche, any historical figure, but maybe Nietzsche most of all, with less reverence. Nietzsche's someone who tells us philosophy's job is to, in part, destroy idols, or at least to show them to be more hollow than we thought, to make us have a little less reverence for the things we worship, right? But we often treat Nietzsche like an idol, and we insist that you have to take him whole or not at all. You have to either take him all together in all of his proper context, displacing nothing, or you just have to reject him. And that's why we get these really severe cases where some scholars seem to just worship Nietzsche and agree with everything he says. Others just want to say he's awful, we throw him out, he's no good, he's a reactionary, he's a fascist, whatever, right? That comes, I think, from a kind of reverse reverence. If you want Nietzsche to be the great Satan that you oppose yourself to, you're still treating him as an idol, this pristine thing that can't be broken. And I'm saying treat him more, we should be more like mechanics dealing with a car. The engine may still be good, let's keep that. The body is bad, throw it out. Let's tinker, let's play with it. Let's build it and rebuild it. Let's try something out, see if it works. If it doesn't work, we'll disassemble him again and rebuild him. And I think that takes a different attitude towards historic figures than we often have. And that means, too, it goes hand in hand with not reading chronologically, because if you read chronologically, you're assuming the person is this unitary whole thing. And it has a progression. They develop their character, their ideas, their beliefs, their values are going to take this specific course until they reach their culmination, and then you have the whole finished version. And that full finished version is what we need to be true to and faithful to. And I don't think human beings are that simple or that unitary. There are many Nietzsches. They're often contradictory Nietzsches. There are part Nietzsches and whole Nietzsches. This is even a theme of the book in terms of politics. Not to go too much into just the cover of Nietzsche's Immoralism, there are all kinds of interesting things we can pick at there. Some people have noticed that the statue on the front is a statue of the Emperor Constantine, but I'm not going to talk about that. The initial purpose of the image is that this is a gigantic statue. This is a huge, towering statue that has that only remains in fragments that you can see in pieces. And it reminds me of a number of passages in Nietzsche where he looks at humanity and he says, when I look at human beings, what I see is a field of scattered fragments, of parts of people, of not whole people. And it's our job to assemble them. It's our job to bring these pieces together. That's his political project. But I think that's also our job as readers and our job as interpreters. We need to recognize that Nietzsche is a bunch of pieces, sometimes scattered, sometimes broken, and we have to piece him together. He's not already whole. We need to let him be imperfect. We need to let him be undecided. We need to let him be contradictory. And then we work from that. We build something whole, but we do it by accepting this and rejecting that.
I so resonate with that. And again, there's just so much that I kind of want to ask you about. I think it's one of the reasons why I'm so drawn to your approach and that way of thinking about Nietzsche. I think it actually says a lot about maybe psychology and human nature. But again, I think I'm really wanting to get into kind of will to power if we can kind of go there.
Yeah.
As I was thinking about maybe where to start, I thought maybe we could explore some of the common misunderstandings or just some of the ways that individuals, philosophers throughout the years have tried to understand what will to power actually means. Could we maybe begin there and then go to kind of your project and how you understand it?
Sure, absolutely. I don't want to go into too much detail because there's so many different scholars who have interpreted it in so many different ways. So
Sure.
let me break it down to two sort of dominant ones. There's the early one. And when I say early, I'm thinking early 20th century, which was often a casual reading because it was a curious fact about the history of Nietzsche's reception that he was primarily read in the early 20th century and even at the very end of his life, not by philosophers, not by academic philosophers, but by a very eclectic group of creative and thinking people. A lot of visual artists were avid readers of Nietzsche. A lot of novelists and poets were avid readers of Nietzsche. And then a lot of people in a wide variety of disciplines besides philosophy were readers of Nietzsche. Just in passing, it's worth mentioning that Freud was a reader of Nietzsche, even though he didn't like to admit it. His scientific pretensions made him think that he was above Nietzsche. And he sometimes says, Nietzsche gets it right, but he doesn't deserve it. It's on accident. He didn't get there scientifically. The irony being, of course, that Freud would later be skewered for having an insufficiently scientific methodology by his fellow psychologists. So anyway, he wasn't primarily read by philosophers. And I think part of this meant that key texts were read, others were read less. The Birth of Tragedy, one of his first major works, was a very, very popular book. Zarathustra was a very popular book. And I think those are both books which can easily lend themselves to misinterpretation, in part because The Birth of Tragedy is very influenced by Schopenhauer. It's very influenced by the composer Richard Wagner. And so Nietzsche hasn't really come into his own. He hasn't yet defined his own unique perspective. Zarathustra, of course, is written in such a unique and interesting way. It's written almost like a sacred text. And it's a piece of literature. It's done in a very literary style, full of metaphor. So, of course, again, it's very hard to pin down his meaning. So you had these non-philosophers reading these very easily misunderstood texts. And so it's no surprise that the initial reception was very confused. But what was the dominant view? And again, I think it's understandable. The dominant view is that the will to power is a picture of human nature, which basically says human beings are at bottom vicious, selfish beasts. We're vicious animals. We're utterly selfish. We fundamentally don't care about others. And our central fundamental desire is to dominate, control, and exploit the world and everyone in it. And above all, to do so in a fairly vulgar way, right? Through physical power. And so for many early readers of Nietzsche, this was something that led to a kind of semi-fascistic way of thinking about Nietzsche. And there were, of course, important um, political figures in the fascist tradition who read Nietzsche. The Italian futurists, for example, were readers and admirers of Nietzsche, and that's how they read The Will to Power. Mussolini was a reader of Nietzsche, and that's how he saw it. The mythology that that Hitler was admirer of Nietzsche is very misguided because there's no evidence that he had any real knowledge of Nietzsche's work. He name-checked him because he was, a German philosopher. But so this is the original deep misunderstanding. The will to power is a theory of human nature that says we are just disguised, brutal, violent, vicious beasts. And you can see, of course, how that could lead to a very narrow picture of political possibility. What are you going to do with a fundamentally predatory, selfish, egoistic creature that only pretends to be civilized, that only pretends to care about others, that only enters into social relationships as a way of exerting power over others? That was the dominant view. It was part of the reason why Nietzsche was seen with a great deal of suspicion by philosophers. It was also part of the reason why in England in particular, he was seen as a very dangerous thinker because World War II was going on and they associate him with this whole line of thought. And that's when the philosopher Walter Kaufmann writes his book in the 50s on Nietzsche, where he takes on that misunderstanding and he rejects it. And he does a very good job of explaining why that is a misunderstanding. And Kaufmann then initiates, I think, the next major way of understanding the will to power. What he does, and this is absolutely correct, is he says the first problem with the beastly interpretation of will to power is that Nietzsche adores culture. Nietzsche adores the arts. Nietzsche adores philosophy and science and literature. And so when he talks about the will to power and when he talks about great human beings and higher human beings who demonstrate a higher will to power, he always talks about examples of spiritual and psychological expressions of the will to power. And often most of his key examples are cultural figures. Goethe is his principal example of someone who exhibits the highest degree of the will to power. Da Vinci is an example. Shakespeare is an example. Some of his examples include political leaders. Some of them include people who had a great deal of material and political power. He talks about the Borgias in Italy. He talks about Napoleon. But the point is that it's not just this kind of vulgar, crude kind of power. The highest manifestations of the will to power are ways of gaining, exercising, and expressing power that are intellectual and spiritual. Art is one of the highest expressions of the will to power. Philosophy is one of the highest expressions of will to power. So that gives us already a bigger, sort of more open picture of Nietzsche's moral and political possibilities. If human beings can sort of express their will to power either in this very selfish, dominating, violent way, or in this creative, expressive, spiritual way, then of course you have a much more palatable picture of Nietzsche's theory of human nature. A lot of people have drawn on that as a way of comparing him to Freud, because Freud too, you can look at his descriptions of the id, you can look at his descriptions of the unconscious, you can look at his attempt to sort of trace every motivation to libido, and you could say, oh yeah, this does seem to be a very uncomplimentary picture of human nature. But then you have his theory of sublimation, which tells us, oh, these very basic human instincts and drives can be channeled in these very positive and often very social forms. And so for that reason, Freud isn't as pessimistic as he seems. I would say most interpretations of will to power can fall under this general picture, right? That the will to power includes spiritual and intellectual ways of manifesting, expressing, and obtaining power. And because of that, it's not nearly as crude or violent or morally problematic as it seems. Now, that leads to my central worry, right? I think that even these forms of interpretation are what I call quantitative theories of the will to power, in contrast to qualitative theories of the will to power. And in my view, Nietzsche gives us both, right? You can, depending on which passage you look at, depending on which book you're looking at, you'll get a different version. And they tend to fall into these two categories. And the argument I try to make is that these two views are not consistent. We can't keep them both. The quantitative one is not only not consistent with the qualitative version, but it's not consistent with his core philosophy. So we have to reject it for that reason. And I also argue that as we get into his later works, we see the qualitative version becoming more and more central. So for that reason, I actually think, even though the quantitative is the more dominant theory, and even though I think it's the one that sticks out the most memorable passages in Nietzsche are the ones that give us the quantitative view, in part because they're often full of pretty striking, provocative rhetoric. You know, he'll say things like, life is essentially exploitation, right? That's very memorable. It's hard to not have that stick in your head. So when you see a line like that, and then you read on and you see 5 references to the qualitative version, what do you remember? You remember that really powerful passage about life being essentially exploitation, and you forget this more nuanced, complicated version. So anyway, what is my problem with the quantitative view? The quantitative view basically says human beings are motivated by the will to power. What is the will to power? It is a tendency toward, a drive toward states of having overcome some kind of obstacle, resistance, or challenge. Those states are states of inaction, right? You have an action, I have a motivation. That motivation pushes me into an action. That action is trying to overcome a resistance. And my drive is satisfied when it's satisfied once I finish, once I'm victorious. That's the quantitative theory of the will to power. It's quantitative because once I reach that end state, I can now compare my state to my previous state and say, I've increased my power. It could be, crude physical power. I have defeated physically an enemy. It could be intellectual power. I'm engaged in a philosophical debate and I've won the debate. It could be something like just a simple game. You're playing a game of cards you're playing with a friend, right? The quantitative will to power is you want to win the game, right? You want to be finished. The process that gets you there is not part of the drive. The drive is for that end state. The drive is for victory. I call this a will to conquest. In contrast to the qualitative, which I call a will toward contest. Conquest, I think, is self-explanatory. The goal here is to win. In contrast, I'm using the word contest here in maybe a less common sense. Obviously, you can win a contest, and sometimes I'll enter a contest hoping to win. But here I'm thinking of contest as a verb, when you contest something, right? You assert a view, and I'm going to contest it. I'm going to say it's wrong. I'm going to battle it out with you. So the will to power qualitatively as a will to contest means my goal isn't that end state. My goal isn't being victorious. My goal isn't the activity coming to a stop because I've won. My goal is the game for its own sake. My goal is the activity, not the outcome. So why is this qualitative? Because what I'm seeking is not this quantitative measure of now being superior to someone else or being superior to what I was before, which when you think about it is an intellectual judgment, right? I have to compare my state now to my state before and say, oh, look, my score's higher. I'm better. Right? So this isn't a qualitative thing. That's a purely intellectual judgment. But the qualitative will to power isn't about comparing my present state to my past state. It's not about anticipating some future state where I'll be better than I am now. I'm taking immediate and direct satisfaction in an activity for its own sake. Because by engaging in that activity, I feel something. It's the feeling of power that I'm enjoying and finding satisfaction in. Now, this is the opposite, or it's incompatible, because think about it this way. If what I really want is the feeling I get when I'm engaged in this struggle, I'm engaged in this activity of resisting some obstacle, I'm engaged in contesting activity, then what I want is for this activity to continue. I'm enjoying it. I want it to go on. By the exact opposite is the case psychologically with the will to power as conquest. What do I want? I want the game to end. I want to be declared the victor. I want to win. I want to see the scoreboard. So these are two very, very different motivations. And it's true, of course, we have both of these motivations. But the question is, for Nietzsche, which one is the primary motivation? Which is the one that really explains human behavior the most? And I argue that it's the will to power as a qualitative drive for the feeling of resisting activity. We find direct satisfaction in resisting activity. Now, that's a very hard satisfaction to maintain, because if I encounter a resistance that's too great, say I'm playing a sport and I find a competitor who's 10 times better than me, like, we'll use my tennis analogy, right? I'm looking for a competitor. I choose someone who's the best tennis player in the world, and I'm just a good tennis player. I'm going to be miserable. I'm going to feel pathetic. I'm going to feel weak. I'm going to feel powerless. I'm going to feel like I'm not a very good tennis player, even though I am, because the gap between their ability and mine is too great. So I can't seek out a resistance that's too great compared to me. On the other hand, if I'm a professional tennis player, I am not, if I'm looking for a fun afternoon, going to say, I challenge you, an absolute novice at tennis, to a game of tennis. There's no fun for me in that. I'll win, all right. There's no question I'm going to win, but I'm not going to have fun. I'm not going to enjoy it. And again, notice it goes completely against the qualitative theory. The qualitative theory says the teleological goal of the will to power, that is the end, right? My teleology is a strong claim, right? It's a claim about causality. That's why I make a big deal about this in the book. If you accept a teleological theory of the will to power, you're accepting that Nietzsche is telling us something about the primary cause of human behavior. So if the primary cause of human behavior is to be victorious, to achieve conquest, to bring struggle to an end in a state of stasis where I am the victor, then you're basically saying, I am only caused to act, I am only motivated to act by the possibility and the likelihood of winning. That means two things. I am going to be miserable if I win against an inferior competitor, right? Or no, on the quantitative view, I should be perfectly happy, right? I just want to win. I don't care how I win. I just want to win. That's what causes my action. So if the quantitative view was right, the professional tennis player should only want to play against novices. They shouldn't want to play against an equal. They should want someone they're guaranteed to win against. But of course, that's not true. Anybody who really loves tennis wants a good game. And if they want a good game, they're going to risk losing for a good game. So that's one of the ways I think the quantitative theory just doesn't fit. And it only fits in really sort of extreme cases. I'm sure everybody has encountered someone who is just pathologically competitive, right? They really just need to win, and that's all they care about. And they're so obsessed with winning that they will just run through every possible activity they can find trying to win. And they don't actually care passionately about anything. They might play a sport, but they don't enjoy the sport. They're just using it as an opportunity to win. They might be academically competitive. They might be really competitive students, not because they love the subject matter, but they want the A. They want the sort of esteem that comes from the good grade. People like that are a good example of what a miserable existence quantitative will to power would be. And I think it's because it's not our primary motive. It's a secondary parasitic motive. If you can't enjoy the pleasure of activity for its own sake, you can get the compensation of social recognition, which comes from being the winner, right? So I think that's why we also want to win, because it gives us this added additional pleasure, but it's secondary. The primary pleasure is the activity. I sometimes also describe this as a difference between play and games. The qualitative picture is that fundamentally we just want to play for the sake of playing. When you see a child playing cops and robbers or playing tag or playing house, they don't actually really care about the end goal. The goal isn't really that important. And when they achieve the goal, they'll just change the rules so that they can keep the game going. Oh, I caught you. Okay, well now you're the robber and we'll switch roles so we can continue playing.
Totally.
Or I'll be a child who will pretend to mow the lawn to be like daddy or be like mommy, but they don't really care about mowing the lawn. This is just an activity. It's a challenge. It's something that adults get to do and they don't get to do. So it's just fun activity for activity's sake. And so many things children do as forms of play are just repetitive activity, like swinging on a swing. A lot of this reminds me, again, to bring in Freud, of the game of fort and da, there and here and there, gone and there. There's the excitement of playing peekaboo where, mommy's there, daddy's there, now they've disappeared. Now they're back, now they've disappeared. It's an introduction of tension, an introduction of displeasure, of a kind of suffering, and then a removal of it, and a relief, and then a reintroduction, and then a relief, just for the sake of feeling that qualitative feeling. But when we turn those into games, this is a way of, sort of formalizing play. But when you do that, you set up a specific goal. You say, okay, this is the goal of the game. This is how we're going to score the game. This is how we're going to determine who's a winner and who's a loser. This is how we're going to decide when the game ends. All of that perfectly suits the quantitative model, because we're ultimately aiming for that final state that brings the play to an end. And we're doing it with the goal of coming out the victor of conquest. And that can be perfectly great, because one of the things we do with games is we restart them. You put the scoreboard back to 0 and you play again. You reshuffle the deck of cards and you play again. But it can train us to seek the wrong thing. It can train us to forget the pleasure of play and to start to play games not for the sake of play, but for the sake of gaming, for the sake of being winners at games. And all of this makes it very socially useful. This is another reason why I think the distinction is interesting. A lot of games take the form as kind of training for labor. So many games are practice work. So many games are practice business. So many games are practice at being a soldier or being a police officer, right? These are all just ways of making children socially useful to forms of authority. And at heart, this is going against the real spirit of games, which is playing for playing's sake.
Oh, that's so good. One of the things that's coming up, I haven't really thought about this. I end up working with a lot of like young adolescent males, some in their early 20s, and they really get really deep into like video games. Would Nietzsche or what we're talking about have anything to say to that? I mean, would that be seen more as literally the game side, or would that be a type of play? Does anything come up for you there?
This is a great question.
Okay.
It's really interesting. I think it's going to depend a great deal on the form of games, right? And my suspicion is that a lot of video games tend to fall more into the game structure and tend to emphasize the values of quantitative will to power over the values of qualitative will to power. But not all games do that. And certainly many video games are very open-ended in their structure. You have so-called sandbox games where the
Right.
player
Thinking of
doesn't have,
Minecraft.
yeah, a set of rules they have to follow. There isn't a single goal you have to achieve, and you can just sort of play. You can just make it up as you go along. So I think there are definitely games that would fit Nietzsche's will to power, but I think a lot of games don't. I think a lot of games really do um, focus on winning. They focus on score. They focus on conquest. Think of even the way in which video games have become a professional sport where people make a living at it, and then you have an audience rooting for someone to win. And there's even a feature where some video games, I think, try to give you the appearance of play, even though they're very structured and they're very much channeling you in a direction. A lot of games have continual sort of cinematic moments where there's so many cinematic scenes that it's more like watching a movie than playing a game. And you'll have a sort of a film scene, and then you'll have play scene, and then you'll go back to a film scene, and it gives you the illusion that you're doing a lot, that you're independently sort of choosing what to do, but really a lot of it's scripted. A lot of it is pre-scripted, and when it's not scripted, it'll often be very trivial. So you'll have a film scene, and then some sort of choice will have to be made, and the screen will say press X or press triangle, right? And you choose X or triangle. That's a big, major element of free play in this whole system. So I think it really depends on the kind of game. And if I could, I just want to plug a really interesting contemporary philosopher
Yes,
working
please.
today. There's a philosopher at the University of Utah named C.T. Nguyen, and he wrote a book recently called Agency as Art. And it's a really, really interesting philosophical discussion of games. And he does talk about video games as well as other kinds of games. And he talks about both the positive elements. He says that games are ways in which the game designer creates a world. And the purpose of creating that entire artificial world is to create a unique form of human agency that the player gets to inhabit. So the way I create a form of agency is by creating that agent's world. So if you're a soldier, of course, your world is the battlefield. If you're Mario, your world is the pipes or whatever. But a different kind of world creates a different kind of agency because it gives you different kinds of abilities, different kinds of constraints, different kinds of limitations, different kinds of possibilities. So when you enter into a video game, you really get to be a different kind of person, fictionally, in a much more interactive way than you do in, say, a piece of literature. So that's a really distinctive feature of video games, or that's something that I think video games are better at than other kinds of art. But he also has an interesting critique of the way the features of games can be used to sort of subdue us and make us satisfied with the status quo. And his principal example is what he calls the gamification of social media. Social media starts to operate much the same way that, say, a phone game operates. On your phone, you have these little tasks that you achieve, and when you achieve them, you get a little star, or you get a little gem, or you get a little jewel, and you get that little burst of pleasure. And of course, at the end of the day, none of that really means anything. And you're so focused on getting more of these little prizes, you're just completely absorbed in the system they're making you a part of. But we do the same thing with social media, right? We give you a system of likes and retweets, and you get so preoccupied with, oh, am I getting enough likes? Am I getting enough retweets? That you forget about the actual value of the activity. Oh, I was on social media to meet people, to have productive, interesting conversations, to enjoy social life. But instead, I'm just engaged in this contest for likes, or I'm engaged in this contest which often involves destroying people, minimizing people, harming people, diminishing them to bring myself up comparatively. So the negative side of gaming comes out very clearly. And I think his book is really great at showing us both sides.
Oh, that's really cool. I'm gonna definitely have to check that out. Maybe I can reach out to him and see if I can interview him because that
Yeah,
sounds fascinating.
it
Wow.
would definitely be worth an interview. I
Okay.
think it's from 2022,
Okay. So it's recent.
maybe 2021, but it's pretty recent, his book.
Nice. Okay, so Donovan,
Agency as art.
agency is art. Okay, thank you. So, okay, I want to ask you this question. In the book, you mentioned that maybe one really bad interpretation of will to power, which actually gets linked to one of his really popular quotes, I think that gets thrown out there on social media, which is whatever kills you doesn't make you stronger. Can you speak to why that's not the best, like Nietzschean quote, and why that's not a great way to understand will to power?
Yeah, that's a great example. And like a lot of Nietzsche quotes in context, it's perfectly legitimate, but it's so quotable, right? And it's
So
so
quotable.
that it's never going to be seen in context. And so it leads to so much misunderstanding that at the end of the day, I just wish it didn't exist. um, yeah, I have a number of least favorite quotes by Nietzsche. The ones that I just kind of wish nobody knew. The other one is the quote about the void. Right? If you gaze into the void gazes back. These are so ripe for abuse, even though they're great lines in context. So that which does not kill you makes you stronger. First of all, taking this as a description of the qualitative will to power in its proper context, the point here is that we thrive under difficult conditions. Remember that idea that the qualitative will to power is direct intrinsic satisfaction in resisting activity. And let's say this more specifically, in resisting activity against an obstacle that is roughly equal to me. And I say roughly equal because nothing's exactly equal, but also will to power is a drive to activity. So I'm entering into an interactive relation with someone else or even with just an object in the world, but I'm in a relation of activity. And so because I'm active, I'm changing the world and I'm also changing myself in the process. So my level of ability, my level of energy, my level of strength, my level of talent is going to change through the very process. Likewise, if I'm in a contest with someone else, I'm playing tennis with you, the very activity of playing tennis together is going to change your ability and your power as well. So our power relationship is never stable. It's constantly fluctuating, and our very activity is causing that fluctuation. So we can only have proportionate equality, I call it, or I sometimes call it tension equilibrium, because we're trying to stay close to equal, because that's where it feels right. That's where we get this feeling of power, this satisfying feeling of being equal to some strong obstacle. But that's always going to change. It's always fluctuating, and it's going to tend towards conquest. That's part of the problem is the more we struggle, eventually somebody's going to overpower the other and it's going to come to an end. And that's why we mistake that for the goal, because that's the most usual outcome. I'm sorry, now I've lost my my place. I forgot why I was making that belabored point.
No worries, that happens. You were just kind of helping me understand why that quote,
Oh, yeah.
what kills us or what doesn't kill us. That's an interesting Freudian slip. What doesn't kill us makes us
Right.
stronger, and how
Oh,
that's
yeah.
kind of a bad way to understand will to power.
But as a correct way, we'll start there. As a correct way, what he's telling us is that to optimize your feeling of the will to power, and this is also for Nietzsche, to optimize your sense of flourishing, of happiness, of well-being. And in turn, this connects to another important theme. Um, it moves us towards amor fati, or the love of fate. If I'm going to be able to love my fate, because I don't ultimately have deep control over my fate, I'm going to need to usually be engaged in resistance. I can't just be sitting around doing nothing. That won't give me a sense that I'm flourishing. But I need to be engaged in resistances that are usually roughly proportionately equal. And when those are lost, I need to be able to renew them. I need to find new, roughly proportionate, equal resistances. So what that means is we have this somewhat self-defeating drive, right? I want this impossible balance, this impossible preserved state of equality and conflict at the same time.
Would
And it's
that be
never
connected to Freud's death drive, or would you not see it that way?
That's a big question.
Okay,
That was actually
maybe
a
another
major,
conversation.
that could be another conversation. That was a major issue in my dissertation. The short answer is I believe um, that it can't be. That Freud's death drive goes much deeper, and in some ways, it implies an element in Freud's work that is much closer to the quantitative theory of the will to power. So, at the end of the day, that's my claim, that Freud really does ultimately fall into the quantitative picture, and that gives him a much, much more limited scope for social, moral, and political possibility. Whereas Nietzsche escapes it, even though he dabbles with it. And so that gives Nietzsche these possibilities that Freud doesn't have. That's probably surprising to a lot of people, because a lot of people on the political left have no trouble at all accepting the idea of leftist readings of psychoanalytic thought. But
Right.
they hate and abhor and absolutely reject the idea of leftist readings of Nietzsche. And my argument is that the reverse should be true. It's much, much more plausible to give a leftist reading of Nietzsche than Freud. Now, even with Freud, I think you can do surgery. You can
Sure.
cut out the bits that prevent a left politics, but it's harder, I think, in Freud's case. Anyway, back to the quote. I am driven not just towards this feeling of power and resisting activity, but I'm driven towards an impossible situation where I need an opponent who is as close to my equal as possible, which means I'm always risking, when I'm doing it right, I'm always risking being defeated. I'm always risking losing. At one point, Nietzsche says that the highest form of freedom, and we have to use freedom in a very narrow, limited sense for Nietzsche, the highest form of freedom is one in which a person is 5 steps from tyranny. They're on the threshold of servitude. So that's Nietzsche's ideal. And his ideal coincides with what we should be doing in order to feel happiest, to be in our most flourishing, best state. So to be in our best state, we should be seeking out challenges that risk our complete defeat. That's a very frustrating kind of picture, because it's impossible to maintain that perfect equality. And if you choose someone who's a really good competitor, you're making it very likely that you'll lose. So that's why Nietzsche wants to encourage us to accept situations where we're almost killed, where we're soundly defeated, where we're demolished, because that's the only way we can really continually achieve that fragile, tentative, temporary state of equality where we will feel the highest levels of power. So I think it's good to think of this quote as almost rhetorical in nature rather than an assertion about his views. It's an attempt to emotionally push us to do things we're not necessarily inclined to do, that we don't necessarily think are good for us, in the hopes that it will ultimately pay off. If we think, oh, okay, this didn't kill me, I can do it, I'll try something harder this time, because the last thing I thought was too hard and it almost killed me. And I thought I'll never do that again. But hey, I survived. Let's try something harder this time. If he can encourage that kind of psychology in us, he will err on the side of caution, which is we'll try too hard rather than too little. We'll take on challenges that are too great rather than challenges that are too small. We'll learn through doing that to enjoy the play, because we're going to lose the game so often. I think that's the positive way of reading it. The reason it's a terrible explanation of the will to power is because it tells us that the goal is to constantly increase your strength. The reason you want to get closer and closer to a challenge that will finally destroy you, the reason you want to risk getting killed, The reason you, to use the cliche, should give 110%, not 100%, is because that's the only way you're going to move up a notch. That's the only way you're going to increase the scoreboard. That's the only way that weightlifter is going to lift a little bit more this time. And so I think the bad interpretation encourages us to be focused on the score, to be focused on being the winner, to be focused on increasing our power, be focused on being able to measure and point to the way we're better than someone, or we're better than the person we were before. That's why I think it's a terrible, and you know that it often comes up in the context of athletics, right?
Oh yeah.
Or
Actually,
training, right?
yeah.
Training. Okay,
Do you know what I was really thinking? And I actually wanted to ask another question too, but maybe I'll get to that in a minute. Is I end up again, I work with a lot of males in psychotherapy, and I have nothing against weightlifting or that kind of culture, but I can see this type of hustle culture and like pushing yourself to these extreme like limits, and I wonder if it's a way that they're trying to live out kind of a bad reading of Nietzsche.
yeah, yeah. I think it often is, and it's such an interesting example because when it reaches that point, because I think you're right, there can be a very sort of healthy, um, fulfilling way for someone to be devoted to something like bodybuilding or athletics or things like that. But when it reaches that extreme form that you're suggesting, it really becomes a version of what Nietzsche criticizes as asceticism. And of course, when Nietzsche's criticizing the ascetic, he has a very specific model in mind. He's thinking of the religious saint, right? The person who says, I am so in control of my body and so in control of my desires and my instincts and my animal passions. And I'm so devoted to God. I'm so devoted to spiritual aims that I'm going to punish my body. And I'm going to take that punishment further and further. I'm going to deprive it of everything it wants. I'm going to try to live as if I had no body. I'm going to not sleep. I'm not going to eat, and so on and so on. And Nietzsche says this is such a puzzle, because how could a living thing devote itself to depriving itself of life, or of working on itself in a way that harms its life, actually does physical damage? And in the end, he says it's not contradictory. Why? This goes right back to the qualitative will to power. If the quantitative view were right, the ascetic would be impossible. The goal of the quantitative view, increase power. When the ascetic deprives themselves of food, they're not increasing their power. When they deprive themselves of sleep, they're not increasing their power. When they inflict torture or pain or suffering on themselves for its own sake, rather than to strengthen their body or grow their body, they're decreasing their power. So why do they do it? Nietzsche says they do it because they really are obtaining a higher feeling of power. If you can negate your basic vital instincts successfully, that really does make you feel strong. It really does make you feel like you're in control. It really does make you feel like you are the master over yourself. The feeling, the qualitative feeling of power, is what makes asceticism possible. But of course, it's self-defeating, because if you really are destroying your health or destroying your body, then you're also destroying your ability to continue feeling power. So it has to be a balance between the two. The qualitative feeling of power requires some degree of growth. It requires some degree of health. And I think that would apply then too to these adolescent young men who are sort of taking this distorted version of Nietzsche and just constantly trying to prove to themselves that they can do more, they can go further. And I think that is what distorts it into something very unhealthy, and ultimately self-destructive and dissatisfying.
Absolutely. Okay, so this is actually a perfect. Do you have time for one more question, Donovan?
Sure, sure.
Okay, this is a great segue into kind of maybe the final question I wanted to ask you in terms of these young adolescents, or even kind of early adulthood males that I see. The two kind of philosophical sources that I think they end up distorting. One is Nietzsche. The other one is Stoicism.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of wanted, I've in the little that I've read about the two kind of schools of thought, I don't think Nietzsche was a big fan of Stoicism. So I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit to that, but more specifically, I think about this line in Marcus Aurelius's Meditations where he talks about the obstacle is the way. It's kind of a bit of a paraphrase. Is that close to the will to power, or is that something completely different? Do you have any reflections on that?
This is a really great question because I do try to distinguish Nietzsche's idea of the love of fate from Stoic ethics. So I think there are some similarities, but there are very important differences as well. And I think it's also really interesting that you bring that specific example up in the case of young adolescents, because I think there's a very good reason that it's young adolescent men who are more prone to be drawn to Nietzsche and more prone to misunderstand him in exactly this particular way. And it's so important because I also think it links into the tendency of people on the political right to see a certain resonance with Nietzsche as well. So this is an idea that it would be really interesting to explore further down the road some more, because it seems like a really important connection. There's something right about their attraction to this and something distorted about it. And the distortion is small, but it leads to this really horrible direction. This very self-destructive and also maybe other destructive way of approaching the world. Anyway, so back to the Stoics. The fundamental difference between Nietzsche and the Stoics has to do with this question of freedom. I think Nietzsche is, I call him a hard incompatibilist. He does believe that a kind of freedom is compatible with a deterministic universe because I am part of that deterministic universe. He calls me a piece of fate. So you have fate, which is the events of all things from the beginning of history up until the present. And they're all causally interconnected. They're all one thing. And so they can't change. We don't know what the future will look like, but the future is already there. It's going to happen a certain way. When we think about the future in terms of branches of a tree, all of those alternate branches, for Nietzsche, they're imaginary. There really is only one course that's going to happen. But nevertheless, we are part of the tree. That tree has only one set of branches. There are no alternate pathways, but we are part and parcel of it. So it's a mistake to say, oh, because fate is true, I'm not free. There's fate, here's me, and fate is just forcing me to do stuff. Fate isn't something different than you. Fate isn't something separate from you. You're a piece of fate. All of the stuff that you do, you've done in the past and in the future you will do, is absolutely necessary, but that necessity flows through you. Your personality, your thoughts, your feelings, your character, your values, those are going to cause your actions. But they're also necessary. They had to be what they are. So that's the tricky thing, right? And so in one sense, he's a compatibilist because he thinks that's a kind of freedom. My actions can really reflect who I am. They flow from me, even though they had to be. They're just not forced from the outside. They're forced from the inside. The necessity comes from within me as much as from without. But he's an incompatibilist when it comes to morality. Because there's only one person I can be at any moment. The person I am now was chosen by the person I was yesterday. The person I was yesterday was chosen by the person before that, and so on up until the day of my birth, back to the day of my birth. So there was never any moment when I decided who to be. Some previous version of me decided who I'm going to be in the future, and I never controlled that previous version. So this is also found in a contemporary philosopher named Galen Strawson. He's made a similar argument. So that means I could never have done differently than I do. Even if my action is in some sense free, it's a reflection of what I wanted. I couldn't have wanted differently. And so Nietzsche thinks it makes no sense to say in some strong sense, you deserve praise for the good things you do, or you deserve blame and punishment for the bad things you do. Because it doesn't make sense to him because you couldn't do differently. So why treat this as, in some deep sense, your fault? That doesn't mean he rejects the idea of punishment or the idea of rewards. We give people rewards or we punish them because we want to causally influence their behavior, right? We want people to act this way, not that way. But we shouldn't think of those forms of reward and penalty as deserved. And that's not the goal. The goal isn't to give someone what they deserve. The goal is to change people for the good, in a better direction. So it's that rejection of moral freedom that I think separates Nietzsche from the Stoics. The Stoics are also treading a very fine line because they believe the universe is causally necessary. They believe the universe is imbued with reason. Reason is almost like an existing metaphysical thing that structures the order of all things and causes everything. So when something bad happens to me and I complain about it, or I'm devastated by it, someone I love dies, and I just break down and I collapse and I can't function and I can't live anymore. The Stoics will say, you're not being rational because this had to happen. And it was for the best because the universe is rational. It wasn't only necessary, reason is a force of goodness for the Stoics. So it had to happen and it was for the best. Any alternative possible universe would have been worse. So when you complain about this, you're being irrational. So what do you need to do as a Stoic? As a Stoic, you need to undergo this very difficult training process. And that's the similarity, right, to this kind of worldview these young people take up. This, I'm going to be in training. I'm going to build my strength. I'm going to get stronger and stronger through exercise and practice and training. And for the Stoic, you have to do that. You can't just change your mind at will. But you do have this degree of moral freedom where you can transform your attitude over time. So what initially I found devastatingly horrible, I can now start to see as necessary and good. And then I'll be able to adopt that as part of my life, accept it, and continue and lead a good functioning life. Nietzsche doesn't believe we have that freedom. Some people will have the right attitude towards fate, or some people will even be able to improve their attitude towards fate. But those people from the beginning are already what he calls well-turned-out people. They already have the right psychology and the right circumstances that they can either already have love of fate or they can strengthen their love of fate. Most of us, he thinks, don't have the right internal psychology or the right circumstances. So it's impossible for us to truly love our fate. And even if we recognize we ought to love our fate, it's impossible for us to improve it. Because either our situation is so dire, or even if our situation isn't so dire, if our soul is so disordered and so weak that we can't change our attitude, then we're stuck. So this is, again, that question about moralism versus politics, right? As he gets into his later work, he realizes these cultural practices, whether it's writing philosophy books for people to read and learn from, or having philosophical conversations with people, or education systems, or the influence of art and culture more generally, which were those were his hope for much of his writing career. He starts to think those are very limited in how much they could do. And at the end of the day, politics is the primary way in which we can bring about love of fate. We have to create completely different material social conditions that people are born into from day one. Conditions which enable them to usually feel suffering only in the form of relationships of relatively equal power, so that we can then affirm that suffering and even find some satisfaction in it. Those conditions would enable amor fati for more people to a higher degree. The other condition is our internal condition. So that goes back to Nietzsche's psychology. And his basic psychology, this is again important for the issue you've raised. His basic picture is that there are two extremes. Of course, there are degrees between these extremes, but one is the strong soul. The strong soul is one where all of my different motivations and desires and drives, he sometimes calls these undersouls, like little people. Like I'm not one person, I'm many people. So if these people that I consist of, these many undersouls, are able to live together in a kind of order where stronger drives are able to control weaker drives, bringing them into unity. So it's not constant conflict. That's the strong soul, the strong self, the well-organized soul. And then the opposite of that is the decadent or anarchic soul. And in that kind of soul, these many people who I am are constantly at war with one another. There is no structure, there is no order, there is no stability to my character, my personality, to my beliefs, to my values. And so I feel like a battleground. I feel like I'm constantly torn in multiple directions. If I have to make a decision, I can't make a decision. If I have to act, I exhaust myself just trying to decide which person to be, so that when I act, my actions are feeble because I've already worn myself out just controlling myself. And so I'm weak in my relation to myself. I'm weak in my relation to the world. I constantly feel powerless. I constantly feel frustrated. And because of this, we end up with this disturbed, distorted psychology where any resistance feels like an unbearable pain. And so I start to flee resistance instead of seeking it. Normally, I should seek out equal resistance because that's the source of happiness. But if every resistance I encounter is overwhelming, then I want nothing. I want no one to touch me. I want no one to interfere with me. I want no struggle. I want no one to contradict my will. And what does this do? This attracts me to a worldview in which I am the tyrant and everybody is an appendage of my will. It attracts me to a politics that celebrates that kind of absolute conquest and mastery over others. It attracts me to a lifestyle where I destroy myself trying to constantly prove to myself that I am getting stronger and stronger and stronger compared to everybody else who's weaker and weaker and weaker. So it's precisely this complexity of the will to power, its ability to be distorted into the quantitative form, that is, I think, at root of Nietzsche's attraction to this very specific, distorted form of life. That is ascetic, but it's also prone to the compensatory satisfaction of comparative power. I think that's the heart of it. If you are in the highest state in terms of qualitative power, your greatest happiness is your self-control. Your greatest happiness is the resistance you find in yourself because you're equal to it. And in your relationships to others, you want others to be strong. You want others to be powerful, and you want others to resist you. You want them to disagree with you. You want them to contradict you. You want them to surprise you. You want them to be different from you. Just like within yourself, you want surprise. You want multiple personae in your individuality. You want to be constantly inspired by your own thoughts because they come as if from another person. You don't want to be same or homogenous internally, and you don't want to live in a homogenous world where everyone's the same. So that would be the highest state. But in this distorted form, that pains you. Difference pains you. Other people having different points of view and different interests and different values pains you. Even your own self being diverse, multidimensional, and rich pains you. You want sameness, you want identity, you want homogeneity. And the only pleasure you can get, since you can't get this pleasure of equal resistance, is the pleasure of comparing yourself to someone, finding them inferior, and then indirectly affirming yourself and boosting your self-esteem. And so I think this leads to an entire kind of politics and ethics and worldview where my goal is about negating others so I feel better about myself. Think too of how reactionary politics always needs some group to be villainized and scapegoated and degraded. Why? Because that's the only way I can feel good about myself. There needs to be somebody beneath me. I can't improve myself. I can't fix myself. I can't feel better about myself in positive ways. So I can only do it by negatively comparing myself to someone else. Anyway, it's a really interesting set of connections.
It's fascinating. Yeah. Wow. Okay, so I know I've come kind of to the end of my questions. I have just so enjoyed this. I'm just having so many thoughts and want to go deeper into all this. I just want to thank you so much for your time and your willingness to be on this podcast. It's not necessarily like a philosophy podcast. Thank you for giving me a shot. And I hope that you'll come on again because I would love to continue to explore some of Nietzsche's big ideas. I know you'll be busy teaching and I have a crazy schedule, but maybe we can find some time in the near future to connect again.
Yeah, we should definitely do that. See about the possibility of meeting again. I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for the invitation, and I was especially interested in the invitation because, yeah, you weren't an academic philosopher, so I really
Awesome.
like seeing these connections outside of that tiny, narrow little world. So it's
Sure.
been a lot of fun.
Okay, awesome. Okay, until next time.
Until next time, thanks.